When I was in high school, at the High School of Music and Art, there were kids from Music and Art who were coming up here in the summer to go to the Art Students League. So that was my first introduction to Woodstock. I came up during summers for a day or two to visit them. Then around 1960, 61, we brought camp groups over here from the Western Catskills. We were teaching at a place called Lincoln Farm, and we brought truckloads of campers over here, and we went to the Woodstock Playhouse and met Edgar Rosenblum, who then booked me as a musician after the Monday nights or whenever after the play was over. He started to book folk singers in there. So I did that, and then I also played several times at the Cafe Espresso in the early 60s. So that was our introduction to the town. We knew something about it, but not much. Do you want to say something now?
Well, yeah, Woodstock even back then had this sort of, I wouldn't say reputation, but it was a known artist colony, and people were coming here. It was a place where artists went and musicians and writers, so we knew that history. And when we visited several times, I'll never forget the first time I ever went through Woodstock. Must have been this season, because there were the dandelions, like a snowstorm of dandelions that was coming off what's now Bradley Meadows shopping mall. It was Bradley Meadows. And I'll never forget driving through the town for the first time and seeing this incredible storm of just white. And anyway, so we came, we loved it. We ate lunch at Deanie's, which was then like a little railroad car practically. And then the story goes on from there.
In about 1965, we came up for a day or two, and we ran into John Harold, who we knew from the Washington Square folk music scene, and he was a friend, and he said, "I want to take you someplace." And it took us to Big Deep. It was a summer day, very, just a warm, bucolic summer day. And we went over to Big Deep, and it was just like, oh my God, this is paradise. We never saw anything like it. The rope swing. Oh God, it was just, it was just so beautiful. And we just said, we have to come here for at least for a summer. So the next year, we rented a house in Bearsville from the Ballantines, a little kind of a cabin almost that was Teddy Ballantyne's, who's David and Ian's father. And so we rented that house for the summer of '66, and then again the summer of '67. We came back again, and when I say summer, it was like May till almost October. And then we just said, why are we going back to New York?
This is so
it was just so nice. We met a lot of the painters, Ed Chavez and Eddie Vilcher, who was not a painter, but he was in that milieu. He was, and we knew Refugee, we knew his family, and Fletcher Martin we met, and all those kinds of people who were, kind of our elders at the time, and were with the kind of the stalwarts of the community. So we got very interested in that art scene as well as the music scene.
And our kids started playing with Alex Angelock, and so we got to know Nancy Angelock and Robert Angelock, and they were all part of that amazing Woodstock art scene. And then we got connected to the Maverick and all the people that were involved in that. So it's a pretty robust community to move into.
The David Ballantyne connection was definitely a strong one, because just moving into that funky little cottage, and it was really small for, we had 2 kids, and then Adam was born while we were, living in there in the summer of '66. There was just something about living the country life, which we had never done. We'd gone to summer camps, and that was about as much as we had done in the country. So here we were in Bearsville and getting to know the local guitar auto repair guys. Well, the most memorable party was when we were up at the Spiota's house.
Oh, yeah. It wasn't the first, it was the most.
It wasn't the
memorable.
first, but definitely the most memorable. And we were living at the top of this road, Lark's Nest Road, which leads up to Birdcliff. And we rented a house for a year from the Spiota family. So right after Thanksgiving in 1968, we called Bob Dylan, who's our neighbor, and said, we're having a little party, why don't you come down? And Bob said, I don't think I can because I'm having some friends over. So we said, bring your friends. He said, oh really, I could bring friends? And I said, sure, bring whoever you want, it doesn't matter, it's just a little party. And I remember John Harold was at the party and my brother Artie was there. And I think Steve Robin and Abigail might have been there at the time. And there was a lot of local, not necessarily musicians, just local people. So just around midnight, there's a knock on the door and we go to answer it. And there's Bob and Sarah, his wife at the time, George and Patty Harrison, Albert and Sally Grossman, and the entire band all walked into our house. And it was just like that was pretty memorable. Yeah. And George came in as if he was just anybody. He was a Beatle at that time. Please, and he came in and just put everybody at ease, introduced himself, shook hands, mingled. It was very, very nice.
And then stayed.
And he stayed after everybody left and played guitar with me and Artie.
For hours.
Yeah.
Playing songs. It was really pretty.
That's pretty memorable.
Pretty memorable.
Yeah.
I kind of summed some of this up by, I don't remember which of my kids said this, but they were very little, and one of them said, I really love living in Woodstock because I feel like if I ever got lost, somebody would take me home. And that's kind of
How it felt.
what this community is. Supportive, embracing, loving.
There are a lot of young people moving to Woodstock now, just as they were when we came here. Young families. We get to know the musicians who are coming. But I think it's still vibrant in terms of, now the only problem is it's very expensive now. It's not the cheap place where for a couple $100 you can find a cabin in the woods or somebody's garage to live in. But there still are a fair number of very creative people that are moving here from elsewhere. I find it's still vital and,
for kids.
Yeah, and there are
Grandchildren.
Yeah, grandkids live here, and they have, their friends who are teens, young teens. They seem to find really interesting kids to play with and to hang out with. So I think it's still a good community. I guess the real young hipster community seems to be over in Kingston now, and maybe Phoenicia, Saugerties, those places maybe still are a little more affordable than Woodstock. But it's still pretty nice here.
I just experienced, maybe I lived in a bubble, I don't know. I felt people were so nice to me. I remember when we were up at the Ballantyne's house and I had no vehicle. Happy would take the car to New York, or I'd be there by myself, and I'd walk into the corner cupboard, not the corner cupboard, the Bearsville store. And they'd give the kids candy, and I mean, we were just wandering up the road. I had 3 little tiny kids with me, and I don't know, I felt maybe I'm forgetting, but I felt very embraced by the community. I became just very involved in the Guild largely because I love the whole Birdcliff arts community, and I was particularly interested in somehow helping to restore and renovate and sustain the cottages that are up on Birdcliff. As I said earlier, we lived in one of those, and it's a part of town that many people, even in this town, haven't been up to. And when we first came here, there was a theater, there was an opera company, and there still is just a huge amount of activities going on, particularly in the summer, and some people live there all year round. So I got very involved in the Guild, largely because I just wanted to see that community healthy and thriving. And when I joined the board, it was the cottages were in a lot worse shape. They still need a lot of work, but it was a very strong board and a strong group of people, like-minded people, who did a huge amount. Doug James just made an enormous, personal contribution to sustaining a lot of that part of Woodstock, and Gary Kvistad was a fabulous president. And anyway, I became very involved. Happy put on a whole series of fabulous concerts for the Guild, about I don't know how many and for how many years, but we brought in amazing artists to perform all that would help the Guild. And then of course that all grew into the Solstice concert.
Is that how that?
I think so, yeah. The Solstice concerts started at the Kleinert. My brother Artie and I started doing them, and they got too big for the Kleinert. They started to get to be a tradition, so we had to move out to the Bearsville Theater and sometimes to the Woodstock Playhouse. And that's always a benefit for the Woodstock Birdcliff Guild. And we've done it for almost 20 years now. And it seems to, by September, people are starting to ask me, who's going to be in the Solstice this year? And, when can I start getting tickets for it? So it's become, a real tradition. Of course, as musicians, we're always being tapped to raise funds. So we just this month in May, we're doing a benefit for the family of Woodstock, which is going to be it's the 8th annual Bob Dylan birthday celebration at the Bearsville Theater. But we've raised money for all kinds of things over the years. The Sister City in El Salvador, and the things having to do with water supply. We just seem to raise flood relief when Hurricane Irene and Sandy came through. So, it seems like every year there's at least a half a dozen things that we're raising money for. Or when somebody gets sick, very often there's a benefit concert to raise funds.
People whose houses burned down.
Yeah, exactly.
Houses. Yeah, actually one of the earliest benefits we did was when John Harold's house burned down. I don't remember the year it was. It might have been early 70s. And we had a big benefit concert to raise money to try to get him back on his feet after that happened. So, it's sort of the way that musicians can kind of pay back the community by using, and artists, I have to say, do the same thing. I mean, there are many artists or photographers like Elliot Landy is always giving away prints, these classic prints to various groups, and Mary Frank is always giving her prints or paintings. So, musicians aren't the only ones, but we do a fair share of fundraising. But I think you should talk about Friends of Woodstock, because that was a very interesting time.
It was.
Early, yeah. It was historic.
Yeah.
Historic stuff, yeah.
Well, that was started by a group of us it started when, I guess, let me just think what brought me into it. I know there was a big movement against putting a Sheraton hotel or some big hotel right where the post office is now.
Right, the Woodstock Estates.
The Woodstock Estates. And it was just a chain kind of hotel. So a group of us called Friends of Woodstock got together. Ed Sanders was involved, Bob Haney, Cornelia Rosenblum, Robbie Dupree. A bunch of us got together to try to just protect that area in some way so it didn't become just another chain hotel in the middle of town. And we had many meetings and gatherings and confrontations, and eventually we were able to prevent that from taking place. It was a very intense moment. I was also part of something called the Civic Arts Commission, and we were trying to save the Longyear building, which was a building that was in the middle of town, a beautiful, gorgeous old Victorian building with a mansard roof and slate roof. It was right next to where Clouds is, and
Oh, that was early.
it was very early, and at the time the town supervisor was very, I mean, it's a very different time now. I think people have much greater say and people are listened to more readily, but at the time we were just like a pain in the neck. We just wanted to try to save this building because we don't have a lot of historic buildings here. So the then town supervisor said, well, bring me 1,000 names and we'll pay attention to you. So I spent, about 5 straight days with a whole group of people getting these 1,000 names on a petition. It was a marathon getting all these signatures. So we brought it to the town meeting and we very foolishly raised our hand and said, we have the petition, we need you to pay attention to it. And the supervisor said, okay, bring it over. So we rolled it out down the aisle. These 1,000 names, we pasted them all together on this amazing scroll of 1,000 citizens of Woodstock opposing tearing down this building. And he said, out of order, out of here. And he just ended the meeting. And the next morning, the building was, I was coming home from the post office, and it was being destroyed. It was just totally destroyed. They took it down, and by the time I got there in the morning, it was like they were carrying the slate off to the dump, or somebody was taking it.
Yeah.
It was not a good story. And
that was the bank, by the way.
that was the
And
bank.
when the bank was
yeah.
right in the middle of town
The
where
bank
Yum
building.
Yum is
Yes,
now.
that bank building.
That bank was the one that owned that property.
Right, and what did they build? That bank that is
And now
now,
there's actually an empty
now
lot
it's a
there.
nice Yum Yum building, so.
No, but next door. where-
door, it's just an empty lot.
Isn't that something?
Yeah.
I never knew that.
Yeah,
That
so
must have
that
been
was
before my time.
very, very disheartening and very discouraging.
And you were also on the sign committee, right, to try to keep the signs from being like too big or
Or logo signs.
logo signs
Logo
or
sign.
internally lit, like, you know, neon and all that
I
stuff, trying
remember
to
that
keep
controversy.
the town looking somewhat quaint and artistic rather than bringing in, you know, McDonald's or whatever would be logo type, you
No
know,
logo signs.
And it was, to a certain point, it was successful, although
Well, there's
know,
a lot of people that were very annoyed about that.
Especially shop owners.
yeah. shop
Well,
owners,
but a lot of the shop owners were able to maintain, I mean, a few, you know, when you work on something and your vision is one thing, it can sometimes be interpreted to the law.
Mm-hmm.
But I think one of the reasons that Woodstock isn't a logo town is because we have some ordinances in place that don't let people put up all these big signs that are in many, many other towns.
didn't help with Cumberland Farms or something.
Well, some of them got
Yeah,
in,
right.
Some
kind
of
of
them still-
grandfathered in.
Yeah. But that's good. Those are important stories. Name 2 Woodstock personalities who affected the course of your life. You could each
Oh,
take
boy.
one. Or you could each take one. I don't know. Or if you've been to.
Boy, that would be, there are so many. One I would say would be Edgar Rosenblum, who, because he believed in my music and put me on in concerts at the Woodstock Playhouse many times, it gave us an introduction to this town that we wouldn't have had otherwise. So, and of course he became a close friend. So that's a pretty big one, I think.
And
was
he
important.
also ran amazing theater and
Yeah.
his gallery.
But personally,
but
for us, I think
personally,
that was,
yeah.
Boy, there's so many people.
Yeah,
who
so
use
many people.
Linda Sweeney.
You'll think of.
Of course, all the musicians that were here, musicians, various musicians that had been here before we were. But you probably have other people that were meaningful when we moved here.
I'd have to really think about that, like the most meaningful person.
Or a meaningful person.
A meaningful person, of which there were many.
Peter Whitehead was meaningful just because he was willing to sell us this land that we built our house on, and he wasn't selling that much land back then. Although I think by the late 60s when we bought this land, I think he was starting to be financially land rich and cash poor, and maybe he had to sell some land off. But he was all still fussy about who he sold to, but he liked us, and he was very nice about it. He sold us this land, and then we wanted to buy another 2 acres across the way to protect our land here. He was willing to do that too for a fairly low price. So he was kind of a friend in a funny way. I mean, he was a character. He was a very eccentric fellow, but
Changed the course.
But was very nice. Yeah, he changed the course of our living here. We wouldn't be in this spot certainly for the last 40 years.
And he also was, now I can think about this more than then, because when you're a kid, what do you know? But he really is the link to that original arts community.
Yeah.
That at the time, had I only realized that, I would have asked him a lot more questions. We used to sit and have tea up on his little deck and look out at the valley and talk, and he'd come by our cottage, and as I said, he played table tennis, ping pong with us, with me particularly, I guess. But yeah, he was a major figure.
For both of you.
Yeah.
I had always heard that he was anti-Semitic, so I'm finding
No,
this really interesting.
I think his father was absolutely anti-Semitic, because all the history books, everything about Woodstock was that the reason that Ralph Whitehead and Bolton Brown and those guys decided to put the artist colony here was because there were no Jews anywhere around. But I don't think Peter inherited that. I mean, we never asked him, obviously, but he loved Bob Dylan. Certainly he was fascinated by Dylan, and he liked us, and I never got any kind of a whiff of that from him at all. He was so I think maybe he overcame his parents' antipathy. I don't know, but certainly we weren't aware of that at the time, even to bring it up. I don't know if we would have anyway, but
yeah, right.
But he was certainly he was always nice to us, and we never felt anything. So
I don't think it crossed our minds.
No, it didn't.
So that's an indication that you're not thinking about that.
Okay, so if any other personality pops into your head, go right ahead. If someone asked me that, I would say Jerry, because he sold us our first piece of property. So
right.
Everybody has a different...
But Jerry, it's true, Jerry became such a good friend. And he was he just did so much, not only for us personally, but for this town.
You know who was an interesting, very influential person in our lives, in my life particularly, was Father Francis.
Mm-hmm.
For those who don't know, Father Francis had the little church on the mount up on the top of Meads, and he was this monk-like, very strange, wispy fellow who was a pacifist and just a kind of a eccentric fellow who was a rebel from the Catholic Church. He called himself an old Catholic and was kind of aligned with some Middle European or Eastern European sect of Catholicism. And there were lots of stories about him, but for us, he was, when I became a conscientious objector in the early 60s, very early 60s, he was the only religious person that we knew, aside from a friend who was a Quaker, who would actually stand up for me. And because in those days, in order to be a conscientious objector, you had to have a religious reason for doing it. Now, I really was never religious, ever. But in order to make the point, we spoke to him about it, and he totally backed us up because he was a pacifist and wrote a letter. I think he wrote a letter for us, or
Yeah.
I don't know if we still have it
You
somewhere.
might have
But we took camp groups, kids to see him, and in that little handmade church up there, and so beautiful up there, and we stayed friends with him through the years until he died.
We
Pretty
helped
much.
him a lot. We brought water and
We brought him
supplies,
wood, and we happened to help him bring wood in when he was sort of heating in that place with his wood stove. So he was kind of an important guy in Woodstock for us, and it was kind of interesting. But it just struck me that early on.
You and James started a homegrown business called Homespun Tapes. Tell us about how that got started.
It really started when we were in New York on 78th Street before we came here in 67, right before we came here permanently. Happy was giving guitar lessons, and then he started going on the road, and his guitar students were without a teacher. So Happy decided to record some lessons for them for a while he was gone. And it became very clear very fast that these lessons took many hours to record, but these people wanted them. And then we came up with this idea, Happy came up with this idea of just doing a series of lessons that he could give to different people. They didn't have to be to that one person, but they'd be on a particular subject. And then we started reproducing them. I did that while Happy was on tour, and it was called Homespun Tapes, which we came up with that name because they were being spun on actual tapes.
They were reel-to-reel.
Reel-to-reel tapes. And I would spin them and splice them and put them in boxes, and we'd get 1 or 2 orders, and I'd put them in the mail to people. And then we got the idea of advertising. We took out little tiny ads to see if anybody wanted them, and lo and behold, people wanted them. And it just kind of grew out of that idea. And then Happy asked his brother Artie to...
Well, first we moved to Woodstock.
We moved to Woodstock in between.
And suddenly there were all these people around here who I could call on to teach instruments. I started thinking, well, if I'm doing it, maybe, Artie could do some things that I wasn't as good at doing that he was. But then there was a fiddle player named Kenny Kosek who was living here, still out playing very well. So we brought him in. We brought David Cohen, who was a piano player, who had been with Country Joe and the Fish, who was living up here. We brought him in to do piano. This was all audio, no video at that point. Bill Keith moved here a year or so later, and we got Bill Keith in to do some banjo stuff for us. So we started reaching out to the local talent, and then from there it just went further and further afield. And of course the audio tapes turned into audio cassettes, and then audio cassettes turned by the early 80s into video cassettes, and video, then video became DVD, and now it's downloads and
Is that
streaming
what it is now?
online. It's DVDs and downloads and streaming on the internet.
Amazing.
But from that little beginning, we now have something like 500 titles.
You should really write a book about this.
Over
I think
200, over 200 instructors teaching. So it's become our business. So I think between that and the books that I've written on guitar playing, I don't know. I can't imagine how many people there are that have used the stuff. It's got to be in the hundreds of thousands or millions of people. I don't know.
And unbeknownst to us, we've managed to document a whole time period in American music and traditional music.
Yeah, people that are long
gone. And then we have
Doc Watson, Bill Monroe, Pete Seeger,
talking
these people.
about their music.
Yeah.
So it's quite a treasure trove of information. And I should just say, for the kids' part, I mean, there is more in their lives than what I mentioned. They were incredibly impacted by this community, by our friends, by the people that would be in this house when they came home from school. It was really quite a way to grow up, and they say that they used to love to come home from school because they'd never know who was going to be here and what kind of party there was going to be. So they were tremendously impacted by growing up in this environment, community.
So the Woodstock Mountains Review really came about. Artie and I started playing together in about 1967 or 68, and after a couple of years of playing together, we signed up with Albert Grossman to be our manager, and Albert got us a contract with Capitol Records, so we made 2 albums for Capitol Records, which was kind of the big time, and we made 2 pretty good records that people still like and call. They're kind of collector's items because they're hard to find now. But after those did not do commercially particularly well, we decided to bring it back down, and there was a new label starting up called Rounder Records. So Artie got in touch with the guys, the Rounders, as they called themselves, which were 3 people who had started this little label. And he said, what if we got some people together who we played music with around Woodstock, and just did a record of folk songs that we do, you know, when we're just at a party here. So they said, great. And this was maybe their 8th or 9th or 10th record. I don't know how many they had made before us, but not many. So we had been having a lot of parties with people, with Bill Keith, Jim Rooney, Maria Muldaur, John Harold. There was a bass player named Tony Brown who was living here for a while, who hasn't lived here for years and years. Artie's then girlfriend Lee Berg was here. And it was kind of a loose affiliation of people who just like to play together. So we all packed up and went up to a studio up in Glens Falls, which Artie had heard about. We literally slept on the floor, spent 2 complete days just playing music pretty much live. And we came up with this record which we called Mud Acres. And Mud Acres was named for the house that Artie was renting, which when it rained really got muddy, especially in the spring when, you know, everything was thawing out. And, you know, so unbeknownst to us, it was such a, Eric Kaz was also part of that, who grew up here as Mother Kay Kaz, was a well-known Woodstock character and a real estate agent. And his dad was actually a sculptor, and but I don't think his dad ever lived here in Woodstock. But anyway, so we made this record, and it became kind of what's known as a classic. It's still, you know, people still have it and love it. And I think the thing that people liked about it is that it has this really great community spirit to it. It's just loose, friendly. You can tell everybody likes each other, and it's just a nice, warm recording. So we put that out, and then we all went our separate ways. Artie and I were on the road quite a lot together as a duo then, with various people in our different bands that we had. And then about 5 years later, we decided to have a reunion. And this time, some people had moved away, like Maria Muldaur wasn't here anymore, and but Bill Keith and Jim Rooney and John Harold and Artie and I, and then somebody who had come into the scene, Pat Alger, who's a wonderful songwriter and guitar player, had joined us. And then other people started saying, hey, I want to be in on this too. So Eric Anderson, John Sebastian, Rory Block, Rolly Sally had moved in. He became our permanent bass player for a long time. So then we all got together, and Paul Butterfield was part of it for a while. It was all kind of a core of about 8 or 9 people, and then a loose conglomeration of whoever was around. So we ended up making 3 more albums for Rounder, and the best known one was called Woodstock Mountains, and so we call ourselves the Woodstock Mountains Review. And we made it at Bearsville, at the Bearsville studio. And then we went on the road, and this core group started playing. We played in New York, we played in various other places. We went to Europe together in 1978, I think. We went to Japan in 1977 with a group called Mud Acres, which was based on the first record. So it was, you know, it was a wonderful group, and we had a reunion, our last reunion, I think in 2003 maybe. Mm-hmm. We did 2 nights at the Kleinert, which was really nice. That was the last reunion we had, but that was, it was a great group, and we all stayed very good friends, you know.
Did you mention John Harold?
I did mention John. I think I did mention John Harold.
One of the core people.
Yeah, and Larry Campbell
joined
us. Larry Campbell became an important part of the group.
Really important part.
He's now become an important musician in the world. So we had quite a nice group.
How important is Woodstock in your life story as a final?
It is our life story. Woodstock is our life story.
How can you quantify that? I mean, it's where we live. It's where our roots are. It's where all of our best friends are, and everybody comes to visit us here. And it's where everybody wants to come. Our kids want to be here and visit and celebrate vacation, you know, holidays with us. And
one of our kids lives here.
April lives here, of course.
With her husband Barry Price and 2 kids, so we have that here.
But it's where we live. I mean, we've lived here longer than we've lived anywhere else in the world. By far.
Yeah, and it'll be 50 years since we moved here. So permanently next year will be, you know, the time we actually moved up here permanently will be 50 years, 67. So, you know, we didn't live anywhere else for 50 years, that's for sure.
It's more than a place to live, really.
It's more than a place to live. It's a place to place to be, and a place to just experience everything that's really good in life.
I don't think we could have come to Woodstock in the 1960s if there wasn't a strong music scene here. And just by serendipity, that scene just exploded in the 70s with the Joyous Lake and the Whitewater Depot and the Woodstock Playhouse and all these different venues that were going on at the time, and a lot of the great artists that were moving here and just showing up for a period of time. You know, when you could see Van Morrison and you could see Bob Dylan and the band, all the guys from the band, who were very important people in our lives, and you know, it was just tremendous. I mean, you could spend an hour just talking about all the different people that were in this town at that time, and it just kind of formulated a gestalt here that was unheard of most other places.
And many of our friends came here. They followed us. They came to visit and said, "This is a place we want to live and stay." Bill Keith came, bought his house, and never left. You know, it just was people came to this community, and actually people that have even left for various reasons come back with a huge amount of emotion attached to it, feel like somehow this is their home.